Hello, my lovely witches. Today I am bringing to you a little video that's a bit different. It's about paper. I love paper. So this is about the types of papers that you might want to create to use in your journals, books of shadows and grimoires. Some of these techniques will probably be familiar to you, others maybe not so much. So we'll start with one that I think pretty much everyone knows, and that is coffee and tea dyeing. There's so many videos out there on how to do this. I probably don't even really need to explain it, but predominantly you put tea or coffee into a dish of hot water, and then you put your papers in, leave them to dye for a while, pull them out and dry them. Now you can see some of mine are really quite dark. That's because I have dried them in the oven at too high a temperature. I am guilty of doing that sometimes. So that's where they almost, it's not quite burning, but it sort of heats it and makes it quite dark. So anything can be coffee dyed and tea dyed. I love to use coloured paper in the coffee dye. I think it creates a really nice effect. Or things like this printed note paper. This is more coloured note paper. This is a handmade paper with some botanicals in it. Some of this is just copy paper is the word I was looking for. And there's some decollaged note paper and what have you. So you can do journaling, index cards, you name it. You name it, you can coffee dye it. The other sort of dyed or affected paper that I have used in my journals quite a lot recently are these papers, which come from my Disintegration Collaboration bundle, which I have talked quite at length about in my most recent Book of Shadows tour. Book of Shadows 14. So if you want to go and have a look at that, I will explain in detail what this is about, but essentially it's hanging papers or putting papers outside to weather with the elements. And you can see you get some really quite interesting effects. Again, it sort of dyes paper, especially if you're using coloured paper. You can add tea bags to it, you can add coffee to it, you can add things like nails and pins that'll rust, anything that can create interesting effects. You can tie things up with string, which gives you interesting patterns. You can use papers that you've previously printed or painted on, newspapers, all sorts. So that's another type of paper you can use in your journals, and you will have seen that in my journals. Another paper type that I love to use is painted papers, and you can do this in a lot of different ways. You'll see this is a piece that's just had some watercolour put on it. It's not watercolour paper, so you don't get that same sort of bleed effect that you get with a thick sized watercolour paper. This is using some leftover paint and ink from a palette. And that's, again, a great way to use up leftovers that are sitting in your palette from other art projects. Just put them on some paper and let them dry and use them later in your journals. This is one where I, again, used watercolours, but I used quite a lot of metallic watercolour. Again, it gives a nice effect. I've also sprayed this with a little bit of alcohol while the paint was still wet, which gives you this sort of mottled effect. It's really pretty. This is, it's a liquid watercolour, or it's sort of a dye-based ink, as are these. And again, you can see this is some pretty interesting effects. You can do this same sort of effect by drawing on paper with textures, markers, and then spraying it with water and letting it bleed. Just plain watercolours. Again, this is the watercolor with some alcohol sprayed on it. You can also do the same thing with salt, and that's without. This is alcohol ink that's just sort of blotched on the paper. This was cleaning up some alcohol ink. More alcohol ink. This is on some onion skin paper, which I love working on. It's not easy to get these days. It used to be used a lot for airmail letters because the thinner the paper, the cheaper the letter. This is also onion skin paper, just painted with some watercolor. This is just regular old pad of lined paper. You can see some of these bits have had bits cut out of them because this is my stash that I use to pull from when I'm working in my book. This is on a blue piece of paper, which has given a nice effect with the watercolors. This is actually photo paper. I have a whole bunch of this photo paper that I picked up recently, and I've used some inks with this, and it's given this really interesting effect as well. These are scrap bits of paper that have been used for all sorts of sort of oversprays and things, but this is actually alcohol ink, as are these, which have been more deliberate. You can see I've cut some pieces out of them, just dotted the alcohol ink onto the paper, and it gives this lovely sort of bleed effect. So that's painted papers, or one type of, or several types of painted papers. There are, I suppose, other types of painted papers, one of which I am also going to show to you. I can pull them out, and that's using jelly prints. If you happen to have a gelatin plate, they're quite expensive, so you know, don't feel you have to rush out and buy one if it's not something that you are desperately drawn to do. But I happen to have a jelly plate. I have way too many art materials, but I do love to use them. And I have used some stencils and some rubbing plates, and even this is bubble wrap on these pieces. You know, I see these, most of these are some little scraps. There's some botanicals. And jelly printed plates are great. This is just paint put on directly onto the plate, so you don't necessarily have to imprint things onto it. You can just roll your paint over it and then print it. And I love to use these particularly for labels for headings, and you know, where I might be writing text and things on a page that's maybe in my junk journal that's got quite a lot of background illustration, or I've used a book page or something. This is stamping onto a jelly plate with cut apples, just squiggling on a jelly plate. I think I probably used something like a cotton bud, or even the back of a, you know, the end of a paintbrush, back end of a paintbrush. So, you know, there's a variety of different things you can use with your jelly plate. And again, there's 5,000 tutorials out there on jelly printing on YouTube. If it's something you're interested in, please look it up. But it's certainly one way I love to add layers and depth and texture to my journals or books of shadows. I also will do the same thing, but usually with just plain jelly printing on sticker paper or label paper. This is just the full sheet label paper. I love this. I use it so often, and you can see I keep a big stack of these for, I also use them for labeling things like potions and oils and incenses and anything. You can use it for anything. You can use it to label jar spells if you want to put a label on your jar spell, container spell. Awesome. And I also do a bit of jelly printing on this deli paper, or you can do it on tissue paper, and these can be quite nice for just a sort of a leaf in between pages, or you know, as almost like a divider. Or you can stick them down, you can write on them, you can draw on them. I also love the way they sound. You can put them just straight into a junk journal when you're making the junk journal. You can see a whole bunch of things. I've used stamps and things here on this one. So that's a fun type of jelly printing to use in your books. Then we have another type of painted paper here. So this is a paint scraped paper. This is something that I actually got from another YouTuber, Melanie Sullivan. I will link her channel to this video so that you can check it out. And it is using acrylic paint on paper, but scraping it on and then sort of dotting it on it, scraping it. And you need to scrape it really, 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 really hard to make sure that you're not left with any sort of raised bits that are going to be sticky and stick your pages together. But it's a lovely way to use acrylic paint in your books, and you could do this directly into the book. I do that sometimes, or you can put it onto papers. Sometimes I'll do papers like this and actually bind them straight into my junk journal. Again, to add some bright colours and things to the journal. And you can do it on any kind of paper. This is an old index from I think it was an atlas. There's some note paper that's been written on. More music sheets. So, or just plain pieces of copy paper. It's an old book page. This is an envelope. Again, I sometimes quite like to bind envelopes into my junk journals as well. And then you've got a little sort of tuck spot once it's bound into the journal. So check out her video on how to do that. I love it. It's a very therapeutic thing to do when you just want to zen out for a while and do something that's creative and useful for you without having to focus on a particular project. You know, put on a movie in the background or what have you. These are, again, this is using some art materials that you may or may not have. Don't worry if you don't. There are other things you can use, but I've used these metallic sprays, ink sprays. I think they're the Dilutions, Ranger Dilutions sprays. The metallic sprays are great, but I will say the sprays get clogged really easily, I think, because it's got mica powder. It sort of clogs up the nozzle. So I've actually had to replace the spray bottle a lot in using these, no matter how hard I try to keep it clean and do all the things that they suggest on the box. I have found that they do clog. So those are great. There's some pieces that have been done with that. Another way that you can spray papers, this is a combination of alcohol ink. This is the gold, is an alcohol ink. And the other is just regular acrylic ink that I have put into a spray bottle and mixed with a little bit of water. But you could do the same with some watercolor. You could do it with even a very watered down acrylic paint. And again, you get these nice effects. This is using a product called Brusho, which I love. It's actually, technically it's a powdered dye. It is super messy to use, which is part of the fun, but just know that because it's a powder, it can get everywhere. So you need to really lay out, you know, newspaper or something to protect your desk. Don't wear your best clothes when you do it. It's a great product. You either spray the water over the powder that you sprinkled on the paper, or vice versa, water first and then sprinkle the powder over the paper, and it creates some beautiful effects. I need to do another batch. I haven't done any for a while, and that's my last little scrap. So I might have to set myself up for a bit of a messy session at some stage in the near future to create some more. Then we have, these are old delivery bags that have been spray painted, and spray paint is another great way of getting some interesting effects and some nice painted papers that you can use. You can either use, you know, the whole sheet. Again, you can do it on any kind of paper. I do like it on this grocery bag paper because it's quite thick. That's alcohol ink just in a spray bottle, and acrylic ink in a spray bottle. This is actually Overspray papers. You can see where I was spraying something else. But again, you get some interesting effects, and they can be fun to use in your books of shadows as well. And again, these are just inks, watered down inks in spray bottles. So the sprayed effect, just something else that's a bit different. And if you're looking for some exciting new art materials, have a check out of those products, Brusho and the Ranger Dilutions metallic sprays. And the last bundle that I have to show you today is some marbled paper. I just recently did a session of marbled paper the other day. Again, this, if you are me, it's quite messy because I didn't wear gloves when I did this because I'm an idiot. I knew I should have, but I didn't. So there are a lot of different ways to marble paper. You can buy marbling kits. They're quite pricey, and I don't know that it's necessary. I've seen tutorials on YouTube for all sorts of ways using alcohol inks and water, using nail polish and water, using shaving foam and paints of some kind. I haven't tried that one. But the method that I find that I love the most is using spray paint. It was an experiment that I tried when I decided to make some marbled paper, but I had no oil paints anywhere. And then I thought, oh, of course, spray paints are oil-based. So I got an old baking dish. It's got to be one that you never, ever want to use for food ever again. And I actually use it for coffee dyeing and all sorts of bits and pieces. And you put water into the baking dish. I put it inside a cardboard box so that I have a kind of a spray booth. I do this outside or somewhere with really good ventilation. And then you literally just spray the paint into the water and stir it around with a stick, or paddle pop stick, something like that, end of a paintbrush. And then you dip your papers into it. This is where you should use gloves, because if you don't, you end up with just paint glued to your fingers, and it's really gross. It's really hard to get off, and it's probably not very good for you. Hello, Godric. Thank you for joining us. So you can get some really lovely effects with marbled paper. Let me just move Munchkin out the way. Come on, sweetheart. There you go. I love marbled paper. Now, because this is an oil-based paint, particularly where it's quite thick in places, it's not easy to write on unless you're using something like a paint pen. But if you are using a paint pen, it works really well. So this is done in a variety of different colours. I have quite a lot of different spray paints because I use them a lot. I will often just spray pages or paper. Book pages in particular come up really nicely with spray paint over the top because you can still see the text underneath, but you've got a nice surface to write on. But you can see you get some really pretty effects, and the paler ones like this one is probably a second go. So you've sprayed your paint in there, you've swirled it around, you dip your paper in and you dry it, and then you might take another piece and dip that in. And you get these paler effects where there's less paint, and you need to sort of play around a little bit as to how much paint to spray into the dish, and that's just experimentation. Look at this one. I love this one. This is really pretty. I particularly like adding some metallic spray paint to the mix, but you don't have to. As you can see, These they vary quite a lot. Like this has obviously got quite a lot of thick paint, probably too much. Whereas this is a bit thinner, and you've got some really interesting marbling going on here. So there you go. That's it. That's my little chat about creating interesting papers to use in your books. They all sort of have a nice magical look or feel to them. They're great for, you could actually do them with more intention. I just do a bunch of papers and then use them as I journal. But if you wanted to, you could do something with a bit more intention. You might choose paints with a particular color, and you might focus on an intention as you create the paper. That might be a nice way to incorporate even more magic into it. So I hope this has given you some ideas, some inspiration, gets you out there and creating in your books, journals, whatever. Have fun. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye, my lovelies.